Hello everybody and welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading the book Harold St. John by Patricia St. John with permission of 10 of those publishing companies. And we are reading chapter 12, The Man. Just want to add a little something here. We must remember that this book was written in the 60s, and you'll be hearing words that were used back and then that have a different meaning today, like the word gay is used, and back in those days, but the true meaning of that was truly gay. But now it has been made to mean something else totally different, which is sad. But I will be just staying with the exact words that are written in the book, so I just wanted to let you know that before I start reading. Now let's begin. Reading chapter 12, The Man. Some men are only gay in sunny weather, but my man's joyful, rain and shine together. And some are critical and naught can please, but my man thinks it's perfect if I sneeze. And others never praise, they fuss and whine, but everything I do is simply fine. And some men's appetites are hard to please, but my man's quite content with bread and cheese. And if I wrote these couplets by the score, I could but praise this dear man more and more. So looking back across the years I can but say, oh, thank you, God, for such a man, for there never was a man like my man. It's extracts from a gay rhyme written by his wife for their 31st wedding anniversary. Harold St. John carries 10 cubic feet of holiness about with him, and you can feel it, wrote one of the leaders of the Young Life campaign. The most saintly man I have ever known closely of any creed, wrote a member of the Roman Church. There was an atmosphere of peace and otherworldliness about him, which was very real means of blessing to us, remarked a lady who sat near him at a dinner table. I regarded Mr. St. John as one of the greatest Christians I have ever met. His face was perfect inspiration, for he just walked with God, wrote a senior missionary in the China Inland Mission. Yet there was nothing aloof or remote about him, except that he loved solitude. He radiated joy, wrote a close friend. When in contact with his fellow men, there was a warmth and a genuine happiness that attracted all types. The chairman of Nathanael Lars described him as a fragrant, Christ-like courtesy. Another old and valued friend of his, Mr. A.H. Bolton, expressed it as a remarkable loveliness of character, a meekness, a gentleness not born of weakness, but of spiritual strength and communion with God. We always regarded him as a perfect Christian gentleman, wrote another, in whose home he'd often stayed. His gracious, generous spirit has been both a challenge and an inspiration to us. His touching and kindly interest in our children's pleasures was the mark of a great and generous man. His refusal to speak unkindly of any, however much provoked, was a similar mark. Certainly, the Holy Spirit had stamped on him in a striking way the features of divine love as seen in 1 Corinthians 13. Withal, we loved him for his selflessness. A prince among the saints, he seemed most happy, like his master, to go among the lowly. Though a man of culture and fine breeding, sensitiveness, we admire that grace which made him prefer to travel steerage or live in the Salvation Army hostile for down-and-outs in order to show them the grace of Christ. Only his master can rightly evaluate his Nazariteship and the hardships he so joyfully imposed upon himself in his disciplined, self-sacrificing service. Discipline, humility, courtesy, joy. The words were repeated hundreds of times over in letters received after his death as the outstanding marks of Mr. St. John's character. As one ponders them, they seemed as linked as the steps of a ladder. The bottom rung, a man must lay for himself by a continuous act of willpower and self-denial until self ceases to become important. And out of this proved self-forgetful humility there springs that reverence and regard for others, which must always be the fruit of a heart at leisure from self. And in one that asks for nothing for himself, the gift of joyful contentment comes naturally. For in such a life of selfless giving, there are few real disappointments. Limits and frustrations cease to exist, for there is always some direction in which a loving heart can pour itself out. It was a premeditated ladder, an ideal carefully thought out and held to through life. It was probably consciously formulated on a certain sea voyage when somewhere near the equator he was lying in his hot cabin. He switched on the electric fan. He noticed that in starting up the fan made a good deal of noise, but little breeze came from it. Later on, at high power, the fan was practically invisible and almost soundless, but the cabin was filled with a delicious airy breeze, and the young man in his bunk prayed passionately that he might be like that electric fan, powerful for God, yet self-effacing, and with this in view he kept under his body and brought it into subjection. And to this end he disciplined himself rigorously in matters of bodily appetite, the use of his time, his hours of sleep, and his methods of recreation. For years he never had any breakfast except a cup of tea, and he broke this habit at the end on medical advice only. He was a consistently early riser. He liked to listen to his wife reading good books aloud to the children, and he often played games with them. But he himself seldom read fiction and had no hobby beyond his work, to which to him was in itself joy and relaxation. Nor did he ever go out for any sort of sport except swimming, although he was a great walker and would cheerfully start out in the early afternoon to walk 17 miles to an evening meeting. As an old man, he always gave one the impression of enjoying life so much that these restrictions were barely noticeable. But as a young man, they must have loomed large. He disciplined his time, too. Many people came to talk to him on spiritual matters, and they often found him intensely sympathetic and accessible. But once the point had been reached and the issue faced, he would gently and firmly close the interview. "Let's ask the Lord about it," he would say. Dropping on one knee, he would pour out his heart to God and then courteously say goodbye. For gossip and pointless small talk he had no time whatsoever, and at certain types of tea table he was not always quite a social success. He would quietly withdraw mentally into some green pasture of his own when he should have been making suitable replies about the weather. And the systematic discipline of always seeking out the lowest placed and the hardest way made him a very humble man. Humble beyond the ordinary, wrote one who frequently traveled with him. We have known him walk from station to station carrying a case to join a group of men, any one of whom would have counted an honor to have met him at the station. He would then slip into the room, scarcely noticeable in his entrance to the house. And to this man, so emptied of pomp and ceremony, so at leisure from himself, men were irresistibly drawn. Here was someone who had time for them and who would not despise them. An older man who attended the Griddleton Conference in 1949 has a memory of Mr. St. John that became a turning point in his life. The conference was mostly for young people, and the older man may have felt a little out of it until he met Mr. St. John, pacing one of the long corridors of that beautiful country home. Mr. St. John placed his arm across my shoulders, wrote this man years later, and for about 15 minutes we walked up and down. Somehow the conversation led him to discover that I was a railroad man and expecting to retire. And I evidently said, which was true, that I had seen little apparent spiritual fruit in my life. Mr. St. John looked at me in the face and said, "My brother, you may have another 15 years of service for the Lord, and you may find them the most fruitful of all, I think. And the years of my life since then have been the most fruitful of all." Men were drawn too, not only because Mr. St. John was at leisure from himself, but because they knew that he loved them. It was a love that believed all things and hoped all things, hoped so deeply that he tended to see people through rose-colored spectacles. He was sometimes exploited and taken in, but this did not upset him unduly. It was strangely rare. Far more often the evil was stemmed by the very impact of his trustful love, and men tended to become what he believed them to be. A case in point was when, through unwise business dealings of one man, a whole group got into difficulties about some church property. The landowner was an exceedingly grasping woman, and a lawsuit and severe financial loss threatened. There was much heated discussion, and Mr. St. John, who had been in no way involved, offered to visit the woman, and having with great difficulty gained admission, he found himself in a little home bearing marks of deep poverty and a sick child laying on the bed. Very little was said about the financial problem, much about the sick child, and by the end of the visit the woman was in tears, pouring out her sad story of bereavement and sickness and sin. Mr. St. John visited her again with a Bible and material help, and storybooks for the little girl. Without any further discussion, the woman proposed a reasonable, honest transaction. He grieved deeply over that woman and her poverty and sorrow, and thought and spoke much of her in the days that ensued. For to him every individual was intensely important. He was a man whose heart yearned over the multitude, and once in an opening prayer at the Birkenhead conference he asked God's rich blessing on all those who spent their lives for the comforts of others. The lamplighter who lights our streets for us, the miners who go down into the bowels of the earth to bring the coals to warm us on those winter nights, the fishermen who brave all weathers to bring us food, the Navy who protect our coast so that we can gather fearlessly. His loving, heartfelt gratitude embraced them all, and how yearningly he would reach out to seek to find some point of spiritual contact with his fellow men. He was standing at the door of the gospel tent, inviting people in, when an elderly gentleman approached and declined Mr. St. John's invitation very courteously on the grounds that he was on the way to the exposition of the Holy Sacrament. "Tell me," said Mr. St. John eagerly, "what does the blood of Christ mean to you?" "It means everything," replied the stranger, "for time and eternity." And he went his way. But Mr. St. John often spoke of the joy of that sudden moment of communion. "At the cross our paths diverged," he would say, "but we met there, if at no other point." He was gloriously hospitable. "Do drop in for tea," he would urge strange families at the Sunday morning meeting. Sometimes, however, he forgot to mention it at home, and an enthusiastic crowd would arrive at the front door just as the family were finishing tea. "I'm afraid you were expecting 6, but we are only 4. His wife was a genius at carrying off these situations, but his children rather spoiled her efforts by relapsing into helpless giggles. The family learned to be ready for anything, and Sunday tea became a standing joke. Nor was it only tea. Mr. George Goodman arrived with a bag, apparently invited and considering himself expected for the weekend. Mr. St. John had gone to Ireland. Yet apart from these slight lapses of memory, he was a soul of courtesy at home and always treated his wife and daughters like queens. He loved to help in the house, but apart from looking after babies, at which he excelled, his domestic efforts were not always successful. Some rather elegant ladies were once expected to tea, and Mrs. St. John was not very well and went to rest after dinner, making Mr. St. John promise to wake her in time to prepare. She was only woken by the last minute by her beaming husband. "Nothing to worry about, darling," he proclaimed triumphantly. "All is ready," and he ushered her excitedly into the drawing room, to the table laden with piles and piles of great, thick, sparely buttered doorsteps. The ladies were actually arriving. There was an apologetic, feminine whispering and laughter in the passage, but our guests were sports. They munched gallantly away, and the party was a great success. That innate lowly charity forbade him to speak ill of any or to judge unless it was directly his business to do so. A group of young men, aware of this characteristic, sought to test him once by discussing in front of him a certain individual who had been giving a great deal of trouble. "Mr. St. John," said one of them, turning suddenly on to the hitherto silent listener, "tell us honestly, what do you think of Mr. X?" There was a pause, and the thoughtful brown eyes twinkled. "What do I think of Mr. X?" he repeated. "I think he has a perfectly charming wife." On another occasion, the conversation drifted during a meal to another group who were causing controversy. Some spoke critically until Mr. St. John suddenly spoke out. "I have heard that some of these men have been much used in evangelistic work and have helped some of God's saints in days gone by. Shall we just bow our heads in prayer?" And after he had thanked God for the way he had used them, had asked them to bless them in further service, the conversation was shifted to a better subject. He practiced this method and preached it in a sermon he once delivered on the judgment seat of Christ. We are absolutely bound to judge everything that takes place in our own churches and our own private lives. These things we are bound to judge, but the moment we judge anything outside of that sphere, our judgment is challenged. Perhaps it's something to do with the service of another man, or a company of Christians with which we are not identified. Then we are absolutely prohibited from issuing our judgment, and we should keep our opinions to ourselves. For instance, some time ago there came to our town an evangelist, a man whose methods are not those to which I have been accustomed. A good man came to see me one day and said, "Mr. St. John, "Isn't this terrible?" And he began to tell me of some of the extravagant, peculiar things this man had done. I said, "My dear brother, stop. Tell me one thing. Is this man preaching Christ?" "Well," he said, "I can't deny it." "Well," I said, "let's get down on our knees and pray that God will bless this man's ministry and use him for the conversion of souls." This is going to be the end of part 1, and tomorrow we'll start with part 2 of chapter 12, The Man. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.